Hi everyone, my name is Charlotte, and since we're all trapped inside and I am bored, I have decided to start a YouTube channel where I talk about the books that I'm reading. I have been reading a lot lately, as I'm sure most of you have as well, because we're all stuck inside, I don't have my commute anymore. It's really nice to have this extra time to read, and I've been taking advantage of that. In this video, I'll be talking about everything I read in April and what I'm planning on reading next month in May, and just giving a brief review of each of the books I've read. I may do in-depth reviews on some of these, but I just wanted to have a list of everything, and then if people want specific reviews or me to talk more in detail about any of these books, please let me know in the comments. The first book I read in April was Niall Ferguson's The Square and the Tower. I read this from my library as an ebook, so I just have this picture of the cover on my iPad. And this was a very interesting book that I sort of read for some research I'm potentially doing in grad school. And a lot of it is about networks and the idea that throughout history there have been periods where hierarchies were dominant, such as the Middle Ages and feudalism, and then there have been periods where networks were dominant, like today. I think that's an interesting thesis, and he's clearly a very well-trained historian. I especially enjoyed the first couple chapters, which were a really good overview of network science for people with a non-math background. However, I did think that it was pretty clear that he's quite conservative, and sort of, I guess, midline Republican in the US in his political views, and that definitely came through in a lot of how he viewed historical events and some of his writing. That doesn't mean he isn't necessarily an interesting intellectual scholar, but I definitely found that a little bit, to me there were gaps in his analysis as a result of that, because he often blamed things entirely on individuals rather than on systems, which was interesting, especially considering this book was so much about the structure of networks and systems themselves. The next book I read was Germania by Simon Winder. Winder? I'm not sure. This is a history of Germany from, I guess, sort of pre-Roman times to 1933, and it's very much a humorous, sort of almost coffee table book. I actually, if I was going to recommend you read this, I would say it's more a better choice to read, like picking it up for 15 minutes and then putting it down again, because it was a bit of a chore to plug through. It's definitely more of an anecdotal history where he goes to small towns and he talks about little anecdotes in history, which is very enjoyable, but it isn't for sure like a sweeping historical narrative. I definitely had a good time reading this, but I think if I had read it over a slower period of time, I might have enjoyed it more. The next book I read was Quiet by Susan Cain. This is a book about introverts and sort of how our society is very focused on extroverted qualities. This was a fun one to read during social isolation because we're all kind of introverts now, and I'm definitely an introvert, my whole family is, so this was definitely a fun pop psychology book to read. Another thing that I found hilarious about this is that this is actually my mom's copy, and she flagged all of the pages in the book and wrote our initials on them for who she thought this best represented. So I could be called out as I read this book by my own mother. The next book I read was Wayward Son by Rainbow Rowell. This is the sequel to Carry On, which is actually based on the fictional book inside of her book Fangirl. I have read all of these. I think this was a very fun road trip book. I definitely liked it better than the first one because I think it had fewer of the narrative constraints that the first one had, where the first one, because of where it came from, which was effectively as a fake Harry Potter fanfiction in her previous book, this one did not have that because it's sort of past the end of that narrative. It can sort of move on and do its own thing, and so I liked it a lot better. I read it on a day where I was just feeling kind of sad about the world, and it was definitely like a good, fluffier road trip sort of travel book that I really enjoyed, and it was kind of what I needed on that day. I also really enjoy how yellow the cover is. It makes me happy. The next book I read was On the Clock by Emily Gundelsberger. This is a nonfiction book, also very yellow, on low-wage work in America, and I thought it was very good. I had read a couple books on this topic before. Specifically, what she brings to the table is that she actually went and worked these jobs because she was laid off as a reporter. She works at Amazon, a call center, and McDonald's, and that personal memoir bit really, I think, provided the glue that drove the story forward. So there was also a lot of sort of more traditional reporting and nonfiction writing in here, but I think that the fact that she was actually experiencing herself, while also being very aware that she has coming from a place of privilege because she gets to go back to her reporter job after this is over, that was really positive, I thought. The next book I read was The State of Water by Obi Kaufman. Obi Kaufman is a Bay Area illustrator, naturalist, and he also wrote the California Field Atlas, which I also have read. I love his books. They're beautiful. He does these data-driven maps that he then sort of annotates and discusses in the text, and he also makes these absolutely gorgeous watercolor illustrations. We'll have drawings like this one. This is Hetch Hetchy, which is the valley where a lot of San Francisco's water comes from. It also has these beautiful maps, which are then explained in the text over here. So this is the Colorado River Basin, and he goes through all of the different points of interest and discusses a lot of the ways that the history plays into it. This is a really interesting one. If you can't tell, I'm from California. I'm from Oakland. You can see the map in the back. And so I think it's really cool that we have this local historian being able to map the natural history and geography of the state and really think about localized solutions and impacts of climate change, humans in general, and how we interact with the environment. The next book I read was House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. This is a book where I read it in paperback, but I had to give it back to my friend who I borrowed it from, and I would definitely recommend reading it in actual paper form because it has a lot of experimental literary aspects where the text is arranged in creative ways. There's areas where there's very little text on the page, there's a lot of text, there's pictures, there's different colors of text, and I think a lot of the physical experience of reading the text is related to the actual book that you're reading. It's, in terms of the story, it is about a man named Johnny who finds an academic manuscript about a documentary about a house that is one spooky boy. This house, it's like bigger on the inside, it kind of eats people, and I really enjoyed this because it has a driving plot. Even though it's very literary and experimental in places, it also has this really like pacing forward movement because you really want to find out what's going on with this house, how this family that has moved into the house has been affected by it, what it means. There's a lot of really good foreshadowing. I didn't enjoy the frame narrative. I thought Johnny was kind of a creep and not very fun to read, and I don't think it added that much to the story. I don't think it added that much to the story, but at the same time, I really enjoyed the main part of it, so overall, I had a good time reading this book. The next book I read was On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. Ocean Vuong is a poet, and this is his first novel. It's almost a memoir. I was never really clear on exactly how much of it was based directly on his own life, because it is about someone who shares a lot of identities with him, where it's about a gay Asian man who is specifically the son of Vietnamese immigrants, and Ocean Vuong is in the same category of that. It is a beautifully written book. The actual text and prose is gorgeous, which makes sense because he's a poet. It is literary in the sense that not very much happens over the course of the book. It's a lot about people's experiences on the interior and describing sort of their memories and their emotions. There were moments where I don't think all of his metaphors really landed, or I think it would have used more of a novelist experience and less of a poet's, because I think a lot of the techniques that he uses that work really well in poetry don't necessarily all translate to the novel. But overall, I thought this was a beautiful book. It was a pretty quick read, but it's very sad. I read this book when I can sink more deeply into the language and do some close reading, because I think it would really benefit from that. The next book I read was The Stoic Challenge by William B. Irvine, and the subtitle is A Philosopher's Guide to Becoming Tougher, Calmer, and More Resilient. This one sucked me in when I was looking for some ebooks, and I downloaded it. It is like 150 pages, so it's quite a quick read. William B. Irvine is a professor of philosophy, but unlike a lot of philosophy professors, he has basically chosen to adopt a specific type of philosophy of life to live by, and that is Stoicism, and he's written a couple books on this. I was already sort of familiar with the ideas of Stoicism, and I think that this is a pretty surface level introduction, so if you have no actual experience with reading Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, I maybe would recommend this book. I certainly didn't think it added that much to my understanding of the philosophy in general. And I think that my main criticisms of it were that it is kind of in the same way that The Square and the Tower is, backdoor conservative in a way that I did not appreciate necessarily, where I did actually think that a lot of his points about Stoicism being useful to modern life, and especially useful to the pandemic situation, where we're all in the situation that we have basically no control over the external world, and understanding that and coming to terms with it and not letting things that you are entirely out of your control affect your emotions. To me, that is actually very good advice. However, there were definitely moments where he tipped over into recommending that people not seek therapy because psychologists only foster a victim mentality, and saying that people who feel like they're victims are only victimized because they choose to feel like they're victims, which there is some truth to the idea that the stories we tell ourselves greatly affect our psychological well-being. However, I don't think that means you shouldn't go to therapy, or that psychology is not useful for people. So I think that part I did not enjoy. Overall, it was a very quick read, though. I think he has some other books that maybe delve deeper into the philosophy, so maybe I would pick up one of those instead of this one as well. The next book I read was Maggie Stiefvater's All the Crooked Saints. I picked this up a couple years ago, and I think it's actually signed. I think I got it at a bookstore reading event that I went to for her. And I just hadn't gotten to it, and it's a standalone set in Colorado, rural Colorado, in the 1960s, and it's about this family that can perform miracles. It was really interesting because it's deeply grounded in specifically Mexican Catholic culture, and it's also written in a third-person omniscient point of view, which is pretty rare. So often the scenes will bounce between a couple different points of views in a really interesting way. I fully expected this to be a pretty quick YA read, and I ended up actually really enjoying it, and it says a lot about what humans need from each other and the darkness inside us all, and how we sort of can exercise that in both a literal way, because the miracles that these people perform basically remove the psychological darkness from people and make it physical in some way, and then the person has to figure out how to overcome that as a way of sort of learning a psychological lesson. I enjoyed also because it is a family story where there are certainly like romances and narratives among multiple young people and friendship narratives, but the key is sort of about the older family versus the younger family, and there's a lot of sort of intergenerational characters. It almost reminded me of a Gabriel Garcia Marquez book in that it was very focused on this specific place. It was a little bit magical realism-y, and it had a huge cast of many family characters stretching back generations. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a fun read, and I was really pleasantly surprised by how much I got out of it. The next book I read was Being Salmon, Being Human by Martin Lee Mueller. I thought this was a really interesting book, if you can't tell based on the large number of post-it notes I have in it. I had been sort of waiting to read this for a while, and I think it's just a really interesting philosophy book about the Norwegian industrial salmon industry and wild salmon in the Pacific Northwest and indigenous foodways there. And it sort of compares and contrasts them and uses them to talk about modernity and the Cartesian split, and how a lot of that sort of psychological basis in the scientific revolution has led to really damaging narratives. Maybe I'll do a second video on how I convert chaos notes like this into notes that I could potentially use in the future. But yeah, until then, I really enjoyed it. This next book is kind of cheating because it's a book that I had already read most of previous to this month, but I did finish it in this month, so I still count it. And that is Michael Chabon's The Yiddish Policeman's Union. For those of you who haven't read any Michael Chabon, he also wrote The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which I believe won the Pulitzer. I think it won the Pulitzer. And he's based in the Bay as well. Shouts to local authors. I really enjoy Michael Chabon's writing. I've read a bunch of his other stuff. I think probably most of his other books actually at this point. So this was one of the only ones I hadn't finished, and I don't know why. I was like 3/4 of the way through, and I hadn't read it in a year, and I decided to pick it up and finish it. And I enjoyed it. It is effectively a mystery about a murder mystery, but set in Sitka, Alaska, where in this alternate universe, after World War II, instead of setting up a Jewish state in Israel, Palestine, we have now set up a Jewish state in southern Alaska, which was an actual plan that was proposed. So that's wild. And a lot of it is sort of about the Jewish experience and the Jewish American experience. Chabon himself is Jewish American, so a lot of his books sort of deal with this as well. And I think it's just it's a really fun alternate history book where something has gone slightly differently, and it's basically spilled out into this really interesting implications for later history. This next one is kind of cheating because I have not actually finished it yet, but I do think I will finish it in April. It is currently April 28th, so I have 2 days, and I've been plowing through it. This is A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. I have actually already read this book several years ago, but I really wanted to go back through and reread it and page flag it. So you can see I've started page flagging it already. This book is one of my favorite books. It is set in Japan and also on a remote Pacific Northwest island. I don't know why I find this incredibly soothing. The setting is just very beautifully written, and it is about a lunchbox that washes up on the shores of this Pacific Northwest island with a journal from Japan in it. And the woman who finds it is one narrative, and the girl who is writing the journal is the other narrative. A lot of it is rooted in the fact that Ruth Ozeki is actually a Zen Buddhist monk, and a lot of the discussion in this book is about Zen Buddhism and a lot of its concepts of time and how that relates to this story, and I find it incredibly soothing. I think it's a beautiful book. I may do a full review on this book because I love it so much. I think it's really interesting, and also I may do it in the context of taking notes on a fiction book versus a nonfiction book, and how I sort of combine that and keep my knowledge from all the books I read. So that was all of the books I read in April. That is a lot of books. I think even for me that was a fairly high month. I believe I read 12 books or 13 books, and I may read a couple more. I think also next month I will probably read even more because my pace of reading has been accelerating throughout April as I have sort of settled into quarantine, and I've realized that the internet is a bad place right now and I don't want to be there, and I have lots of books to read instead. So now I'm going to talk about all the books that I plan on reading in May, next month. This is definitely not a complete list. I like to sort of read things as they come up or they are interesting to me. So I've only picked out, I believe, 7 or 8 books, which is not my full amount of reading I generally do every month. I also have a full, to-read shelf over here that is books I have stockpiled pre-pandemic. So I do have other books to read if I run out of books or I finish these. These are just the ones that I think I'm going to read for sure in the next month. The first book is a book that I actually think I will probably finish in April, and I'm planning to start it today, and I may finish it tomorrow, so this may be an April book. We'll see in my next TBR. But this is The Overstory by Richard Powers. This book is sort of a narrative novel in many different streams of story, but all centered around the idea of trees and forests telling stories in relation to humans. I read the first couple, and for example, the first chapter is it follows a immigrant family that moves to the Midwest in the mid-1800s and plants trees there, and follows basically the next several generations of their family very rapidly as the trees grow. I think these are beautiful stories so far. The feedback I've gotten from my parents and some friends who have read this book is that it does take a while to get into because the stories don't start repeating until all of them have been told, and I believe there are 12 or 16 of them, so you have a lot of learning characters before you get to the point where you start seeing them again. But I'm essentially seeing it as a short story collection, so I'm really enjoying it right now. Next up. The next book I plan on reading is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I actually have read a good chunk of this book already. However, I have definitely not finished it because I didn't feel like I had the time to devote to really flagging it and thinking about it the way I wanted to. And now I do. So I'm very excited to read it. I think this is a beautiful book based on the first a third or so I've read of it. She's an absolutely gorgeous science writer. For context, she is a Native American woman of the Citizen Powhatan tribe and also a professor of botany in New York. She is just a beautiful science writer. One of the things I love about her writing, and I've also listened to some podcasts with her, which I would definitely recommend if you can't get your hands on this book, is that she just knits together a lot of the sort of indigenous ways of knowing and also just storytelling with science and the way that she has seen the world through her lens of being a very well-respected scientist. The next book I plan on reading is Jon Kabat-Zinn's Wherever You Go, There You Are. During this time, it feels like everyone is a little bit anxious, and I think having a meditation practice or learning more about that would be a great way to sort of calm my own anxiety and just feel like I have a better equipment tool belt to move through the world. The next book is also kind of cheating because it is a book that I'm currently halfway through, and that is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This book is written by a Nobel Prize winner about his psychological research. He developed a lot of research about, I think he founded a lot of behavioral economics and also sort of basically human biases, cognitive biases, and ways that we sort of fool ourselves. Next and final nonfiction book I've picked out for next month is William Zinzer's On Writing Well. This is one of the many writing books I have that I bought thinking it would magically improve my writing and then did not read. I'm trying to read them. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to stay updated on what I'm reading, feel free to subscribe. I plan on also doing more videos on how I read and take notes, how I read so quickly, specific book reviews. I'm very open to suggestions. I'm just really bored, and this seems like a fun side project to do while we're all in quarantine. On that note, I will see you next time.